United States on Tuesday cast the sole vote against a United Nations Security Council resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. The American justification was that it feared it could disrupt the ongoing hostage negotiations which were being mediated by Qatar and Egypt. This was the third time that Washington wielded its veto power to block a resolution demanding a stop to the fighting in Gaza. But America finds itself increasingly isolated, both at the UN and outside, in the forceful support that it's given to Israel since the start of this war. Over the last 4 months, Israel has come under increasing international pressure, particularly on the mounting civilian casualties. But America continues to stand by it. Notwithstanding Tuesday's vote, there are clear signs that Joe Biden's patience is wearing thin. Last week, he called Israel's action in Gaza over the top. But more importantly, his government is negotiating a separate Security Council resolution that proposes a temporary ceasefire as soon as practical. This draft resolution was viewed by the New York Times. It also warns against the imminent invasion of the southern city of Rafah, which Israel has been threatening to do for the last few days now. More than 1 million Palestinians have fled to and are seeking refuge in Rafah right now. Until now, the United States has been the single P5 country or permanent member of the UN Security Council which has publicly and consistently rejected demands for an outright ceasefire. It has voted 3 times now since the start of this war against resolutions that have called for a ceasefire. It's the only country in the world that has openly sided with Israel despite mounting criticism. The latest resolution that was brought forth on Tuesday was brought forth by Algeria, and it was vetoed by the US. Algeria's ambassador to the UN, Andre Bentiama, lashed out at America, telling the Council that the veto implies an endorsement of the brutal violence and the collective punishment that's been inflicted upon the Palestinians. He said silence is not a viable option. Now is not the time for being quiet. Now is the time for action. Now is the time for the truth. 13 Security Council members voted in favor of the resolution. America was the only country which voted against, while Britain abstained. The latest draft resolution put forth by the US does use the word ceasefire, something that America was loath to using in previous resolutions. But it also reflects President Biden's shifting attitude towards the criticism of Israel's execution of this war, and in particular, the planned offensive in Rafah. Biden has previously characterized Israel's response as over the top. He's even referred to Netanyahu in expletives in private conversations that he's had with his aides. But here is the bigger problem for the United States. Its moral and political and perhaps even legal authority is being challenged by its almost unconditional backing of Israel. As and when the US brings its own resolution, expect at least 2 countries to veto it: Russia and China, both of whom are Security Council permanent members and both of whom have been at the receiving end of American grandstanding. They will use this opportunity to pay America back in the same coin. The vetoes by the United States, and there have been 3 of them so far, this will also allow Russia and China, who are often criticized for their own human rights abuses, to accuse Washington of being a major roadblock in finding a lasting peace in Gaza. Israel, on the other hand, asserts that Rafah is one of the last remaining strongholds of Hamas. The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has called Rafah Hamas's last center of gravity. The draft resolution also says that an invasion into Rafah would have serious implications for regional peace and security. It also explicitly asks Israel not to invade Rafah under the current circumstances. The question is Netanyahu listening? More than half of Gaza's civilian population has been forced to move into Rafah because of the war. In fact, at the start of this war, Israel had asked Gazans who were in the north and the center of the Strip to evacuate to the south. Most people are crowded into temporary shelters and tent camps. America's concern, just like the rest of the world's, is that a major ground offensive into Rafah would not just harm civilians, but it could also displace these civilians into neighboring countries. Egypt, which borders Rafah, has refused to take in any Palestinians who are fleeing into its territory. There are also unconfirmed reports of Egypt building a wall on its border with Rafah. So the United States is slowly but surely shifting its position. It's moving in a direction which supports a temporary ceasefire, but it has to have certain conditions. The US is tying any potential peace deal to successful negotiations to release all the remaining hostages, as well as lifting all the barriers in further distribution of humanitarian aid. The US has been trying to mediate such a ceasefire deal along with Egypt and Qatar, but so far one hasn't come through. In fact, just last week, Netanyahu rejected a peace proposal from Hamas, calling it ludicrous. On Sunday, much before the UN vote, the United States had forewarned about its veto. The US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, had said that she would veto the resolution presented by Algeria that called for an immediate halt in the fighting. Her argument was that such a move would jeopardize continuing negotiations on a deal that would return Israeli hostages in exchange for an extended pause in the fighting. So the United States is the only member of the Security Council to have voted 3 times against resolutions that have called for a ceasefire. Now, legally speaking, such resolutions are not binding on UN member countries, although some countries tend to ignore them more than others, China being a case in point. The Security Council has no mechanism to enforce its resolutions, but it can penalize those who violate it with sanctions. The United States abstained on a resolution that was passed in December, which called for an extended humanitarian pause, but it did not use the word permanent ceasefire or permanent cessation of hostilities. Israel has said that its forces are continuing to prepare for a ground invasion into Rafah. That is despite escalating international pressure. Not just the US, even many other members of the United Nations, other international institutions, they've all been calling for restraint on the part of Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that civilians will be permitted to leave the densely packed, war-torn city that is Rafah, but it's not clear where these civilians would go to. While Palestinians in Rafah have already fled the fighting multiple times, they say their homes have been destroyed and they have nowhere to go to. The future of any peace in Gaza hangs on 2 factors: how much more patience and leverage Biden has over Netanyahu, and 2, how far Netanyahu can disregard pressure from his biggest ally and friend.